Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Wherry, and today I'm joined by Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who is a professor in the African American Studies Department here at Princeton and also a sociologist. And today we are going to go by our first names because that's just the way we are. Now, we're going to first start out talking about your first book. At the end, we'll talk a little bit about your most recent book, because the great thing about you is you stay busy doing the good work. But let's go back to that first book. So when you were writing from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, what led you to do that? What was going on?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. One is that the uprising in Ferguson had begun the summer before. So I started writing that book in January of 2015. I had just moved to the East Coast the summer previously. So I had been very involved in organizing around police abuse and violence in Chicago. And it was somewhat of a shock to my own system to move to the East Coast, just as things in the movement around police brutality were beginning to heat up nationally. I had been involved in organizing around the murder of Rekia Boyd in Chicago. I was around the orbit of the formation of the Black Youth Project 100 after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so all of which is to say that I was very keyed into the discussions in strategizing and organizing around issues of police brutality. And so then I moved, and then weeks after I moved, I think I live in Philadelphia. I got to Philadelphia July 25th, and within a couple of weeks, Ferguson exploded. And so the book, initially I didn't felt like I didn't have time to write a book. I was trying to write the book that just came out last year, which was a revision of my dissertation. I talked to the publisher a couple of times and basically felt like I had a lot of things to say about what was happening. And many of them came out of the political conversations that I was still engaged with activists, particularly connected to the Black Youth Project in Chicago. And so the book really is written, it's not really organized this way, but in my head it's written as a kind of series of political arguments and interventions into the kind of emergent Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was kind of my intention, was to write a book that was for activists in the movement, but also people who were sympathetic to the movement. And so I was trying to speak in two different registers with it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think you do especially well in the book is you just lay out some basic facts that I think before they're laid out, they seem unbelievable to some folk. One of those facts, I'm going to read it here, is that between 2007 and 2013 in Philadelphia, 80% of the people shot by the police were Black folks. And out of 382 cases, only 88 officers were found to violate department policy. And even among those who violated policy, most of the time there were no suspensions, no terminations, nothing. And so that leads us to ask the question of what's going on? I mean, Philadelphia is, you know, it's
The cradle of American democracy?
Cradle. It's the cradle. So if this is happening in the cradle, you know, usually there's a left-leaning mayor. What's going on? What was going on?
This is happening in every city, across every major urban center in the United States, and you know it creates a complex political situation, because I think most of us who are trained on national politics, you know, you see the spectacle of the Republican Party led by a white supremacist, Donald Trump. And there's a certain level of cynicism and expectation about their kind of knee-jerk support for the police and disavowal of any activist claims of systemic racism in US policing. But the controversial issue is that on a local level, these are mostly cities run by Democratic Party mayors and a Democratic Party machine and establishment that espouse much of the same nonsense, for whom the police can rarely do anything wrong, for whom the police never incur the kind of austerity and budget cuts that every other public institution is subjected to. In the city of Chicago, I mean, we could start with Philadelphia, that in 2012 closed 26 public schools. The city of Philadelphia does not have a public hospital, and yet the city spends hundreds of millions of dollars to sustain its police force every year. The city of Chicago in the same year, 2012, closed 52 public schools. And the budget for the police continues to absorb 40% of the general fund for the city. And this is not even including the hundreds of millions of dollars that municipalities pay out to settle police brutality lawsuits. And so part of this, and it's interesting, I just sent to what do you call it? I just filed a story this morning with the New Yorker. I think that is titled, "Why Are US Police So Racist?" And so part of this is just the price of doing business, which is to say that if there is a political decision that we are not going to invest in poor and working class communities, and when it has happened over decades, that is a political decision. That's not, you know, a budget decision that went awry one year. That's a political decision that has been made. We're not going to raise the tax revenue on corporations and the elite to fund a public sector that deals with the issues of poverty, that creates ladders of opportunity for people. And we know that lack of opportunity creates the social conditions for crime. Thus, we are going to invest in the police and hope the police hold the crisis at bay. And that is what municipality after municipality across this country has made the decision to do. So while every other public service is privatized, is cut, is forced to do more with less, the police departments are robust, they're well funded, they're armed to the teeth, they have insane benefits that no other public sector union is able to garner, because they are seen as Ronald Reagan once put it, the thin blue line against chaos in the jungle. And this is how they perceive Black working class communities. And that is why it's a pattern that we see. It's not Philadelphia, it's not just Chicago, it's New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Columbus, Ohio, Houston, Texas, Austin, Texas, Dallas, Nashville, Tennessee. It's across the country. This is a method of policing in lieu of investment in a public, social, and civic infrastructure.
Yeah, and one of the things that I notice here is that you are not talking about sort of a bunch of individuals and their intentions and people trying to do right and people trying to get a diversity training so they could be more sensitive to diversity. You're talking about institutions.
Racism is so deeply burrowed into the marrow of American policing that there is not a single moment in the history of Black emancipation from the middle of the 19th century into this very day where the police were not completely racist in its characterization and posture towards Black communities. There is no golden age of policing in the United States. And so this is a system, and it doesn't matter who is in charge of it. Black police chief, Black police officers. Since the end of the 1960s, the one significant reform in policing that transformed it from its earlier era is the inclusion of Black police officers. With the post-civil rights policing in the United States is multiracial policing, multiracial contingent of police chiefs, and nothing has changed. There might be fewer police killings than perhaps in the 1950s, but its basic role as a force of social control that is disproportionately trained to surveil Black communities has not changed. And instead, what that era of post-civil rights policing has produced is the era of mass incarceration and has created a Black Lives Matter generation.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the reasons why you turn to the term institutional racism as developed in the book Black Power, written by Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture, and who was recently referred to at John Lewis's funeral. And it was also written by Charles B. Hamilton, a social scientist. So let's dig into sort of this sort of institutional pattern that generates these outcomes, because a lot of people focus on process, and they say, oh, you know, the process seems like it's fair, and we're trying to sort of treat everybody the same, and then we have these outcomes, and part of what you're doing in the book is you're trying to sort of train our attentions onto institutional racism, how it works, and how we get the outcomes that we do.
So I think one of the things with policing that is important is that we unpack the meaning of law and order, right? And I think that in this country, probably more so than any other, there's this belief that the law is this kind of neutral set of rules and regulations that are created to know how to navigate, to govern our society. And I would argue that that is mistaken, that the law is a reflection of power. The law is a reflection of class power. There's a reason why it's illegal to shoplift, but it's not illegal to evict people. It's not illegal for people to be made unemployed during a pandemic. It's not illegal to take people's health care in the middle of a public health crisis. Whereas maybe if there were a different set of people who were responsible for creating laws, those things might be illegal. It might be illegal to turn people out onto the streets during a public health crisis where you actually need a house to protect yourself from the ravages of disease. And so laws reflect social power, class power in a society. And the conception of order is also shaped by these same stewards and shepherds of the society who create these laws. And so the notion that the police are here to maintain law and order is a reflection of the kind of arrangement, the political, social, and economic arrangements in US society that the police are in charge of overseeing and maintaining. And it is essentially to maintain the kind of social hierarchy that dictates the functioning of our society. And so there's a reason why police are disproportionately focused on poor and working class people. Black people are overrepresented in the ranks of poor and working class people. So the police are overly focused on Black, poor, and working class people. And the crimes of the rich and powerful go completely unnoticed. And so that's how you can have, people in prison for life for selling marijuana. It's true. 3 strikes, you're out in California. The phenomenon of 3 strikes laws that come out of the 1994 crime bill, putting people in prison for life for nonviolent offenses. But you can have, out of the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street bankers destroy the economy, destroy people's livelihoods, pushing, predatory loans onto poor African Americans, and not a single one of them go to jail, even though the practices they engaged in were illegal. And so, to me, that has to be a starting point: is understanding that the law itself is not neutral. The state apparatus, the governing institutions of our society are not neutral. They are all reflections and embodiments of class and political and economic and social power in our society. And so for African Americans in particular, who since the end of slavery were described as a Negro problem, were seen as a source of disorderliness because of poverty, because of race, and the ways in which that marked African Americans as a quintessential other, meant that the concentration of Black people through processes of segregation meant that they became of particular interest and surveillance of the police. And as you go through the 20th century, as the presence of Black people sparks, it instigates, the mere presence of Black people instigates homicidal violence at the hands of white people, which becomes then a threat to property value in cities across this country. The police are also concerned about the presence and movement of Black people in that context. They're never worried about white people who were instigating the violence. There's a period in the 1940s, in the 1950s, after the World War II, that Arnold Hirsch describes, a historian who writes about housing in Chicago, who describes it as a kind of quiet decade of violence that is really not talked about. When we think about violence prior, to this post-civil rights era, we think about the riots in the 1960s. Well, before there were riots in the 1960s, there were white people engaged in rioting and mob violence against the presence of Black people, really from the time of the movement of African Americans into urban space at the beginning of the 20th century through the 1960s. I write about this in my last book, that even at the end of the 1960s, 1967, 1968, 1969, white people are still detonating bombs at Black people's places of residence to get them out of their neighborhoods. And so, but none of this instigates the kind of organized, systematic use of law enforcement as a means of social control. That is something that has been reserved for African Americans. And so what happens, Khalil Muhammad has written what I think is the most important book ever written about race and crime, The Condemnation of Blackness, and talks about how the arrest of Black people in the South in the postbellum era then is statistically counted and looked at as evidence, as a kind of colorblind dispassionate evidence that Black people are a criminal race. And so that predisposes the northern elected officials, politicians, powerful people to train police on those communities. And when you over-surveil a particular community, that means that you are then over-arresting them. It's not because they commit more crimes. It's because all the police are in Black neighborhoods looking at Black people, expecting crimes to be committed, and then arresting people. And that then fills the statistical categories once again, proving that Black people are a criminal race, which then justifies again more police in Black communities. And this cycle continues over and over again. And so even if we think of modern policing initially as a class project, right, as an initiative of the ruling class to control working people, to undermine strikes, and all of that, that changes when Black people increasingly become an urban population and are seen and believed to be a source of chaos and disorder, and whose over surveillance then leads to more arrests, justifies more police scrutiny, which creates more arrests, which then helps to cement this idea in the popular culture that Black people are in fact a criminal race. And so those things work together to reinforce each other, to create these perceptions that are still with us today. And then there's a point at which in today's society, this was not necessarily true in the 40s or 50s, where you could get arrested and not have your life completely and utterly destroyed. But if you're arrested now, if you have a criminal record in today's America, your life is effectively over for the vast majority of Black working class people. And so Michelle Alexander talks about in The New Jim Crow how 80% of the working male population in Chicago and the South and West Side have criminal records. And so that means that those people are permanently locked out of the above ground economy. If we want to understand gun violence in Chicago and why it has a particular character it does, is because everybody's got a criminal record, because their neighborhoods have been occupied by the police who just sit and search and watch them. And college students will know, if this were just really about crime, drug crime, everybody knows where in every city where the university is. That's where the drugs are. But the cops aren't on college campuses. They're in Black neighborhoods, giving people arrest records. 80% in Chicago. You can't get a job. You must go into the underground economy to be able to survive. And in the underground economy, people police themselves. And that leads to a proliferation of guns. And then we have gun violence, and politicians act like it's quantum physics. We can't understand why this is happening. We know why this is happening, but the solutions are too expensive for them. They are not willing to invest and pay what is necessary to undo those conditions. And so here we are.
Yeah. So some of the things that struck me were just the extent to which when people talk about color blindness, they talk about this is what the numbers show. That they're basically trying to use instruments that look neutral.
Yes.
As a way of saying, look, I didn't create the problem. I didn't create the behaviors. I'm just reporting out, and my reporting is somehow neutral. And what you're doing is you're sort of demonstrating the dangers of colorblindness for a racially equitable society.
Absolutely.
Which leads me to this other question about the language we hear about the arc of the moral universe. So I hear it again and again. It is said as if it's a law of nature, but it's supposed to bend towards justice.
This is
right when you say no.
This is the other, America. America is the big open vista of never-ending progress. You know, I mean, in some regards, I won't use any profanity. It's a never-ending arc of bullshit. I mean, this is that there is any progress is always a product of struggle.
Yes.
It is not the natural progression of time moving forward. And in fact, you can see that at every sort of turn to make progress is met with incredible, fierce resistance, whether it is a civil war to preserve slavery, you know, whether it is the intervention of political figures in the 1930s to try to thwart an even more expansive vision of social progress with, you know, less expansive reforms. That there's always resistance to creating a more equitable situation for the vast majority, which just means that every sense of progressive reform that has been achieved in this country has come through massive struggle. And even then, as soon as the struggle wanes in the slightest bit, there is a vicious, furious effort to claw back what was gained and to try to push people backwards. How can we still be talking about voting rights in the 21st century? Do you know what I mean? It's like the most basic, elemental aspect of a democratic society, the right to vote. We have to quarrel over this today. And so a right that was supposed to have been won in 1965, we have to quarrel with today. And so that is the real story of the United States is not the, you know, the moral the arc of the moral universe or an onward march towards progress. It's an onward struggle to secure basic rights, and then more struggle to resecure them, which for me in my book brings me to the conclusion that real liberation, real freedom, and what I mean by that is the ability to make decisions about one's life free from economic, political, and social coercion. Which is to say that now we make decisions under extreme economic coercion and duress. And that's not real freedom. Real self-determination is determined by being able to make choices based on what is the best decision to make, not on will this cause me to starve? Will it cause my children to starve? As a framing for making a decision. And so I conclude that that's not possible within the strictures of capitalism, and that an economic system that prioritizes the enrichment of the few at the expense of the mass majority is one in which you will constantly be engaged in a struggle for basic rights, and then a struggle to regain those basic rights, and is not really a society that is ultimately concerned with the enrichment of humanity. So that's ultimately what I conclude in the book is that this is not the best. This arrangement that we have, where tens of millions of people don't have health care, where people are forced to work under conditions that may kill them, for the benefit of others, for a very small group of people. This is not the best that the human species has to offer and can come up with. That we can actually do something different and better than this. We don't have to live with $1 trillion a year, nearly $1 trillion a year being spent on the military, which is as much as like the next 10 other countries combined spend on their military, while we're closing schools, while there's a growing epidemic of hunger in the richest country in the history of the world. This is insane. This is American capitalism, and we don't have to do this. And so that's where I land at the end of my book.
Yeah. Although one of the things that's probably not so surprising for you is that the popular conversation is not about the economic arrangements and why and what might need to be done to them, but it's more focused on the increase of Black faces in high places. And so if we're using sort of the election of mayors, police chiefs, even having finally a Black president as an indicator of liberation, what you seem to suggest is that our eyes are on the wrong prize, that there is something else that's going on in terms of institutional arrangements, the way we've organized our economy, the way we have organized our public spending, and that this other thing about sort of representation, the way that we think about representation misses the mark.
Well, representation is important, but so are politics, right? That matters. So in Missouri, where Cori Bush, a Black working class woman who's a nurse, who was on the streets of Ferguson, just ousted last night in a Democratic primary for a congressional seat in Missouri. Cori Bush is African American. She just ousted his name is escaping me right now, but essentially a Black congressman who has been in this kind of line of succession since 1969. His father, was the original congressperson who occupied that seat. It's been passed through their family. And so he's African American. The Congressional Black Caucus supported him, but Cori Bush is also Black, but represents a different kind of insurgent politics. And so representation absolutely matters, but so do politics. And so identity politics that is only about identity and not about politics is not actually capable of producing any kind of meaningful change. And so I do think historically it's important to say that the turn to formal Black politics came out of an era where Black people were locked out of political power, even as African Americans were becoming more concentrated in different urban localities. The political machine in those places were almost 100% controlled by white people. And so it was legitimate to say, well, we're a majority here, we should have some say over the political process. We should have some say over the process of governing. The problem, of course, develops when the further you get away from the social movement that made that possible. And that is what opened up the space for Black electoral participation, was the rebellions of the 1960s in combination with the Southern movement securing the Voting Rights Act. And both of those together created the possibility for electoral Black politics. But the further you begin to get away from the movement, a social movement on the ground, the more that those elected officials become sort of veterans of it, with the CBC, veterans of Congress, or hold their positions for, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 terms. They're in office for, an entire lifetime. That there is a conservatizing effect with that. And so that's in Black politics, that's no different from what happens in politics writ large. Just because you're Black doesn't give you a kind of predisposition to radical politics. I mean, it can give you a certain perspective that is from the bottom, that creates more of a possibility of seeing things from the bottom, which then may lend itself to a different kind of approach to politics. But it doesn't guarantee that.
Yes.
And so what may have more of an impact in guaranteeing that is a connection to, and some sense of accountability to, a wider political movement or a wider engagement with the community itself. And once that is cut off, then you're in political survival mode. And in some ways, there are certain vulnerabilities that African American elected officials have that white politicians don't. They have less resources, fewer resources, which makes them vulnerable to the Mike Bloombergs of the world, the billionaires who come along and have money to fund programs that you may think are important and may in fact be important. But there's no free money in politics. There's no free money. So all money comes with some stipulation or obligation. And if it's small dollar donations, that comes with its own stipulation and obligations to a much broader group of people. But when it's big money donations to the elite, to an economic class, then that also too comes with political strings attached. And we're seeing, we're not seeing it now. We've seen it over the last generation of Black elected officials who have no connection to any social movement, but who have these structural limitations with resources, and then are become beholden to other financial interests, and who govern in a way that has absolutely nothing to do to the benefit of ordinary Black people. Although many of them are willing to invoke a certain kind of performative Blackness as a way to kind of cloak and cover what it is that they're doing, but without any of the tangible benefits for the vast majority of Black people. So Black politics is desperately in need of the kind of political insurgency that we are seeing now as a way to revive a different kind of a political tradition that is desperately missed right now.
Yeah. And on the topic of cloaking, one of the things that you also do, particularly in your last book, Race for Profit, we always talk about how do we get more people included in the economy? How do you get more people sort of participating in an ownership society? And what you show instead is there are different ways in which particularly Black folks, brown folks get included. There's a form of predatory inclusion that you talk about in Race for Profit. And so I want us to kind of conclude on this theme of predatory inclusion. Can you talk more about that?
It's obviously very easy when you talk about a history for Black people that has been organized around exclusion. to conclude that inclusion is the simple solution. So whether it was Jim Crow segregation, which is obviously all about the formal exclusion of Black people, or outside of the South, where there weren't, there are not signs up everywhere dictating where people can move, but there are the institutional practices of both the federal government, local government, but also within the private sector that also exclude Black people. So in my book, I obviously look at this phenomena in housing and banking, mortgage lending. And so for many people that I describe as racial liberals, meaning that these are people who accept that there are deeply ingrained problems in the United States, but that it's not institutional. It's that if we stop excluding people and simply include them into the institutions of democracy and all of the kind of governing institutions of the United States, then they too can enjoy the fruits of affluence in our society that has created this wonderful white middle class as well. So that there's no institutional critique. There is simply a critique of exclusion. And so the problem with this, of course, is that by simply saying, well, Monday there is exclusion and Tuesday there's going to be inclusion, doesn't deal with any of the harm problems that have been created through decades, if not centuries, of exclusion. And so those harms then become, in the new kind of colorblind discourse, they become the explanation or the pretext for treating Black people differently. So in the realm of housing, decades of disinvestment, decades of forcing Black people to overcrowd into neighborhoods and then underserving them in terms of maintenance, trash pickup, public sector resources, and then saying, well, you're no longer excluded, you're included. And then you go to a bank and it's like, whoa, well, look at this neighborhood. Wow, this neighborhood is really in serious distress. What did you people do? That gives us the excuse now to charge you higher interest rates. It gives us the excuse to maybe say, well, we don't want to actually deal with you at all because we don't think that your property will actually exist the lifetime of a mortgage. And so inclusion without reparation, without actually repairing the previous harm that has been committed, simply leaves most everything intact, including the disadvantages and distortions that racism imposes in the lives of Black people, and says, okay, you're free to join society and have the same expectations and all the rest of it. And so in my specific example, I talk about predatory inclusion and how the inclusion of Black people, but without dealing with the issues around housing that cause deep disrepair in housing and substandard housing and all of this, created the conditions for banks to treat African Americans differently in the marketplace, but without invoking race. They could invoke the condition of Black communities as an explanation, or the conditions of employment, or the conditions of undereducation as colorblind reasons for treating Black people differently in the marketplace, and that this is just as pernicious as describing North Lawndale in Chicago as a quote unquote loss area where we don't do loans. There's a similar outcome. And in some ways, this might even be worse because this is, there's no specific attribution to race. There's just something wrong with you. There's just something wrong with your neighborhood that disqualifies you from participating in these programs. So those are some of the ideas.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that there's even a recent piece by Brookings where
Yes.
neighborhood similar amenities, the appraisers see less value. So there's this value gap that also happens.
Absolutely.
So that, if you're Black, it doesn't matter that you have the same amenities in your neighborhood. And even in those cases, you're going to appreciate much more slowly by virtue of what the appraisers are doing. So you pay more to get less.
I mean, one of the examples I always like to talk about is in Chicago, and I lived in Chicago for several years, which is why it's always a reference point for me. But in the 60653 zip code, which is Bronzeville, you have houses, 4,000 square foot houses that are less than a mile from Lake Michigan, that are new, that are valued at between $600,000 and $700,000, 5 miles north of the business district of Chicago on the north side. Those houses would be well over $1 million. The difference is 60653 is a 90% Black zip code, and so that alone, that's it, is the variable that is a $500,000 to $1 million price differential. And so this is when people talk about the racial wealth gap. This is what it is, and Black people can't catch up. Yeah. And so even if you come up with the financing to pay for one of these homes, it still doesn't cash out in the same way that it does for white people, and they might even charge you more for your loan in the first place, so that even though it's valued less, you are paying more as a Black person, which is the 20th century history of the U.S. housing market. Black people paying more for not the same, in some cases the same kind of housing, but mostly for housing of inferior quality. This is, this is what we call the race tax. It's the basis of the racial wealth gap. And this is why the demand for reparations has garnered new life, because we're no longer talking about racism as just the attitudes of white people. And, do white people want you for a neighbor or not? Do white people like you or not? Do white people want to be your coworker? We're talking about deep financial harm that has been done over the course of generations. We can name the actors, we can name the institutions, and we know that this is a gap that cannot be overcome just by education and hard work alone. It's too deep, built over too long a period of time.
And with that, let us say we have receipts. So you might
receipts.
We've got the receipts. So you might not agree with what we're saying, but we say check the receipts. Check the receipts.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Keeanga, for joining me today and for this discussion. And I look forward to having more discussions with the students about your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.